Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back more than 900 years to explore the incredible story of the First Crusade, one of the most important and dramatic conflicts of the Middle Ages. If you enjoy relaxing history videos that help you unwind while learning something fascinating, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for many more peaceful journeys through the past. Now, imagine Europe in the year 1095. Castles rise above quiet villages, church bells echo across green valleys, and most people never travel farther than a few miles from the place where they were born. News spreads slowly, carried by travelers on horseback, wandering merchants, and devoted pilgrims. Yet one message is about to cross the entire continent and inspire thousands to leave everything behind. In the city of Clermont, Pope Urban II stands before a massive crowd. He speaks passionately about the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, where Christians believe Jesus lived, died, and rose again. He urges the people of Western Europe to help the Byzantine Empire and reclaim these sacred places. His words stir deep emotions. Knights dream of glory, nobles seek honor, priests preach duty, and ordinary farmers wonder if this journey could change their lives forever. Before long, men begin sewing simple cloth crosses onto their clothing, a symbol that they have accepted the mission. Many have never held a sword, while others are experienced warriors. Some hope to earn forgiveness for past sins, while others believe God is calling them to a great adventure. Families gather to say tearful goodbyes, uncertain if they will ever see one another again. Horses are loaded with supplies, wagons creak along dusty roads, and thousands of travelers slowly begin moving eastward. None of them truly understands how long, dangerous, or exhausting the journey will become. Ahead lie towering mountains, burning summer heat, freezing winters, unfamiliar languages, and lands unlike anything they have ever imagined. The First Crusade has begun, and the road to Jerusalem will test every ounce of courage, faith, and endurance these travelers possess. The Crusaders quickly discovered that leaving home was the easiest part of their mission. Every passing week brought new hardships. Long lines of people stretched across muddy roads, with knights riding beside merchants, priests, women, and children. Food often became scarce, and clean drinking water could not always be found. Some families sold nearly everything they owned before leaving, believing they would never return. Others depended on the kindness of villages along the way, hoping strangers would offer bread, shelter, or a place to rest for the night. As they crossed forests and rivers, sickness spread through the camps. Simple illnesses that could be survived at home became deadly during the endless march. Many travelers quietly disappeared from the long columns, buried beside lonely roads that would soon erase all signs of their passing. After months of exhausting travel, the Crusaders finally reached Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. To many Western Europeans, the city looked almost unbelievable. Massive stone walls surrounded glittering churches topped with golden domes. Crowded markets overflowed with silk, spices, colorful fabrics, and foods they had never tasted before. Emperor Alexios farmers welcomed the arriving armies, but he also viewed them with caution. Thousands of heavily armed foreign knights camped outside his city, and although they shared the same Christian faith, their customs, languages, and ambitions were often very different. The emperor hoped they would help recover lands lost to the Seljuk Turks, while many crusaders focused only on reaching Jerusalem. After crossing the Bosporus into Anatolia, the true challenge began. The green landscapes gradually gave way to dry plains where the blazing sun beat down for hours without mercy. Water became precious, horses collapsed from exhaustion, and every distant hill could hide enemy soldiers waiting to strike. The Crusaders soon realized that this journey was not a glorious parade, but a relentless struggle for survival. Every mile demanded courage, patience, and determination. Yet, despite hunger, fear, and uncertainty, they continued moving steadily toward the distant Holy Land, believing their greatest trials still lay ahead. Soon the Crusaders encountered one of their first major battles near the city of Nicaea. Strong walls protected the settlement, making a direct assault extremely difficult. Instead of rushing forward without a plan, the Crusaders surrounded the city and waited patiently while the Byzantine army helped block supplies from reaching the defenders. After weeks of pressure, Nicaea surrendered to the Byzantines, disappointing many Crusaders who had expected to capture the city themselves. Although the victory was important, it also revealed that the alliance between the Crusaders and the Byzantine Empire would not always be smooth. Different leaders had different goals, and small disagreements slowly grew into lasting mistrust. Leaving Nicaea behind, the army marched deeper into Anatolia. Not long afterward, they faced another dangerous test at the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097. Early one morning, Seljuk horse archers launched a sudden attack on part of the Crusader force. Arrows filled the sky as mounted warriors circled rapidly, striking from a distance before disappearing again. The surprised Crusaders struggled to hold their positions while protecting their wagons, horses, and families. For several tense hours, it seemed the expedition might end there. But as the fighting continued, more Crusader forces arrived one by one, strengthening the defensive line until they were finally able to push the Seljuk army back. The victory came at a heavy cost. Many soldiers and animals had been lost, and valuable supplies were destroyed. Even after the battle ended, the army still had to cross vast stretches of dry land under the burning summer sun. Water was so scarce that thirsty men sometimes fought over a single skin of fresh water. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, and heavy armor became almost unbearable in the heat. Yet, despite every hardship, the Crusaders refused to abandon their journey. Each evening they gathered around small campfires, repaired damaged equipment, treated the wounded, and listened to priests offer prayers for strength and protection. Far to the south, beyond countless miles of unfamiliar land, Jerusalem still waited, hidden beyond deserts, mountains, and powerful enemy fortresses. Beyond the harsh plains of Anatolia, the Crusaders finally reached one of the richest and most powerful cities in the region, Antioch. Massive stone walls climbed over the surrounding hills, protected by hundreds of towers that seemed almost impossible to overcome. Instead of attacking immediately, the Crusaders settled outside the city and prepared for what became one of the longest and most difficult sieges of the entire expedition. Weeks turned into months as winter arrived. Cold winds swept through the camps, rain-soaked tents, and food supplies became dangerously low. Hunger spread everywhere. Contemporary accounts describe desperate soldiers searching the countryside for anything edible, gathering wild plants and roots, while horses grew thinner every day. Some men abandoned the army, believing the city could never be captured. Others remained, convinced that turning back would make every sacrifice meaningless. Inside Antioch, the defenders faced hardships of their own, but still refused to surrender. The towering walls protected them, and occasional reinforcements brought fresh hope. Outside, the Crusaders were forced to defend their camps from repeated attacks by enemy forces. Trying to break the siege, every few days another battle erupted beyond the walls, leaving both sides exhausted. Finally, after many months of waiting, an unexpected opportunity appeared. According to medieval chronicles, a guard inside the city secretly agreed to help the Crusaders. Under the cover of darkness, a small group quietly climbed the walls using ladders. Once inside, they opened a gate, allowing the rest of the army to rush into Antioch before dawn. Fierce fighting echoed through the narrow streets until the city was finally under Crusader control. Yet celebration lasted only a short time. Soon a much larger Muslim army surrounded Antioch, trapping the Crusaders inside the very city they had struggled so hard to capture. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. Food once again became scarce. Fear spread through the crowded streets, and many believed their incredible journey might end behind Antioch's walls instead of in the distant city of Jerusalem. Surrounded inside Antioch, the Crusaders faced perhaps their darkest moment since leaving Europe. Their supplies had nearly vanished. Many horses had already died, and disease spread quickly through the crowded streets. Every morning people wondered whether food would be found before sunset. Some soldiers became so weak that they could barely lift their shields, while others searched abandoned gardens and empty fields outside the damaged walls. Whenever the opportunity appeared, despite the hardship, religious ceremonies continued almost every day. Priests encouraged the weary army to remain hopeful, reminding them that they had already survived dangers that once seemed impossible. During this difficult period, an extraordinary story began to spread through the city. A monk claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the spear that Christian tradition believed had pierced Jesus during the crucifixion. Whether the relic was genuine or not remains a matter of debate among historians, but its effect on morale was undeniable. Men who had nearly lost hope suddenly believed that God had not abandoned them. Encouraged by this renewed confidence, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to confront the much larger army surrounding the city. Against difficult odds, they managed to drive their opponents away, securing one of the most surprising victories of the entire campaign. After months of recovery and preparation, the long march toward Jerusalem finally resumed. The army was smaller than when it had first departed Europe. Thousands had died from battle, disease, starvation, or exhaustion, while many others had chosen to remain in captured territories. Those who continued the journey had been transformed by everything they had endured. Their armor was worn, their banners faded, and their weapons scarred by countless fights. Yet their determination remained remarkably strong. As they moved south along the eastern Mediterranean coast, some local rulers decided that negotiation was wiser than battle. Small towns offered supplies or safe passage rather than risking destruction. This allowed the Crusaders to preserve precious strength for the final objective that had inspired them from the beginning. Then, in early June of 1099, after nearly 3 exhausting years on the road, the army climbed a series of hills and finally caught its first distant glimpse of Jerusalem. For many, the sight was overwhelming. Some fell to their knees in silent prayer. Others embraced one another, and many simply stood in amazement, reflecting on the unimaginable journey that had brought them across continents to the walls of the Holy City. The Crusaders soon realized that reaching Jerusalem was only the beginning of the final challenge. The city stood behind strong stone walls, guarded by experienced defenders who had prepared for a siege. Unlike many European fortresses, Jerusalem was surrounded by dry ground with very few trees nearby, making it difficult to build the siege towers and ladders needed to scale the walls. Even worse, the summer heat was intense, water was scarce, and every journey to nearby springs carried the risk of attack. Soldiers carefully rationed every drop, while horses and pack animals struggled beneath the blazing sun. The Crusader leaders understood that a long siege could become disastrous if supplies ran out before the city surrendered. Determined to succeed, they searched the surrounding countryside for timber, carrying heavy beams across long distances. Skilled carpenters worked day and night, cutting, shaping, and fastening enormous wooden towers together with ropes and iron nails. Every hammer strike echoed across the camps, while defenders on the walls watched closely, knowing exactly what was being built. At the same time, archers practiced constantly, preparing to protect the workers once the assault began. Before launching their attack, many Crusaders took part in a solemn religious procession around the city. They walked together, praying and singing as they circled Jerusalem's walls, hoping for strength and guidance before the coming battle. A few days later, the final assault began. Giant siege towers slowly rolled toward the walls while ladders were raised against the stone defenses. Arrows filled the air from both sides, and defenders hurled stones, burning materials, and other missiles down upon the attackers. Fighting continued hour after hour beneath the scorching July sun. Then, on July 15, 1099, one of the siege towers finally reached the walls. Crusader soldiers crossed wooden bridges from the tower onto the battlements, where fierce hand-to-hand combat erupted. Once a section of the wall was secured, more warriors poured into the city, opening gates for those waiting outside. After nearly 3 years of travel, hardship, and relentless determination, Jerusalem had fallen to the Crusaders. The capture of the Holy City marked the climax of the First Crusade, ending one remarkable journey while beginning a new and complicated chapter in the history of the medieval Middle East. Although the military campaign had reached its goal, peace did not immediately follow. The capture of Jerusalem was accompanied by terrible violence, as was common in many medieval sieges. Contemporary Christian, Muslim, and Jewish sources all describe scenes of chaos inside the city, although they often disagree about the exact numbers and details. Historians continue to study these accounts carefully, comparing different records to better understand what truly happened. What is certain is that the fall of Jerusalem became one of the defining events of the Middle Ages and left a lasting memory for people across Europe and the Islamic world alike. After the fighting ended, the Crusader leaders faced an entirely new challenge. Winning the city had been difficult, but holding it would prove even harder. Most of the original pilgrims had expected to visit the Holy City and eventually return home. Instead, new governments had to be created almost from nothing. Castles required repairs, roads needed protection, supplies had to be organized, and nearby territories still contained powerful rulers who hoped to reclaim what had been lost. To strengthen their position, several Crusader states were established, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, along with the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These states depended heavily on a constant flow of soldiers, settlers, merchants, and pilgrims arriving from Europe. Life on this distant frontier remained uncertain. Small garrisons watched over isolated castles, while travelers moved carefully along roads where danger could appear without warning. Meanwhile, news of Jerusalem's capture spread rapidly across Europe. Messengers carried letters describing the extraordinary journey, the victories, and the hardships that had been overcome. Church bells rang in celebration in many towns, and countless people viewed the expedition as a remarkable achievement of faith and determination. Yet in the Muslim world, the loss of Jerusalem inspired future leaders to unite against the Crusader kingdoms. Over the following decades, new armies would rise, and fresh conflicts would reshape the region again and again. The First Crusade had ended, but its consequences would echo for generations. It changed trade routes, diplomacy, military tactics, and relations between cultures, leaving behind a legacy that historians continue to examine more than 9 centuries later. The story of the First Crusade did not simply end with the conquest of Jerusalem. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a completely new era. Across the eastern Mediterranean, castles were expanded, churches were restored, and new settlements slowly appeared around the territories controlled by the Crusaders. Stone fortresses stood on lonely hills, overlooking valleys, rivers, and narrow roads that connected distant cities. Their thick walls were designed not only to defend against attack, but also to remind everyone passing by that new rulers had arrived. Life inside these frontier kingdoms was very different from life in Western Europe. French, Norman, Italian, Armenian, Greek, Syrian, and Arab communities often lived surprisingly close to one another. Different languages could be heard in the markets, where merchants traded spices, silk, olive oil, glass, weapons, and cloth brought from every corner of the known world. Pilgrims from Europe continued arriving in large numbers, eager to visit the holy places that had inspired the great expedition years earlier. For many, the journey remained dangerous, yet the dream of seeing Jerusalem with their own eyes was stronger than the fear of the long voyage. New religious military orders gradually emerged to protect these travelers and defend the fragile Crusader states. The most famous would become the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, organizations whose members combined the lives of monks and professional soldiers. They took religious vows while also training constantly for war, guarding roads, escorting pilgrims, and defending castles against future invasions. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of the Crusader kingdoms, Muslim rulers observed these developments carefully. Although divided by political rivalries, many understood that the newcomers intended to remain permanently. Over time, new leaders would work to unite neighboring regions, laying the foundation for powerful campaigns that would challenge the Crusader states in the decades ahead. The struggle for the Holy Land was far from over. Looking back today, historians see the First Crusade as far more than a single military expedition. It reshaped diplomacy, expanded trade between East and West, encouraged the exchange of ideas and technology, and left memories that influenced politics, religion, and culture for centuries. Even now, more than 900 years later, the story continues to fascinate people because it reveals how faith, ambition, hope, fear, and determination could inspire ordinary individuals to undertake one of history's most extraordinary journeys across continents toward a destination many believed they were destined to reach. As the decades passed, the impact of the First Crusade reached far beyond the battlefields of the Holy Land. In Europe, stories told by returning pilgrims and knights inspired generations of listeners. Around warm fireplaces and inside great castle halls, travelers described towering cities, endless deserts, colorful marketplaces, and distant cultures unlike anything they had known at home. Many of these stories mixed real events with legends, making it difficult for later generations to separate fact from imagination. Even so, they encouraged curiosity about lands far beyond Europe's borders. Merchants also benefited from the growing connections between East and West. Ships from Italian ports such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa sailed more frequently across the Mediterranean, carrying textiles, spices, sugar, precious metals, perfumes, medicines, and countless other goods. Trade routes became busier than before, bringing wealth to coastal cities that served as gateways between continents. Although conflict remained common, commerce often continued because merchants understood that peaceful exchange could benefit both sides. Along with valuable products came new knowledge. European scholars gradually encountered books containing advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, and philosophy that had been carefully preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars over many centuries. Some works were translated into Latin, allowing ideas that had traveled from ancient Greece through the Islamic world to influence European universities. This slow exchange of knowledge helped shape intellectual life during the centuries that followed. At the same time, memories of the Crusade continued to influence politics and religion. Future popes would call for additional crusades, believing that the success of the First Crusade could be repeated. Thousands answered those calls, though later expeditions rarely achieved the same remarkable outcome. Some ended in disappointment, while others brought unexpected consequences that neither their leaders nor participants could have imagined. Modern historians often describe the First Crusade as one of history's most extraordinary journeys because it combined faith, military strategy, political ambition, survival, and human endurance on an enormous scale. Thousands of ordinary people crossed mountains, rivers, deserts, and unfamiliar kingdoms with no maps that resembled those we use today, relying instead on local guides, rough directions, and determination. Whether viewed through the eyes of European pilgrims, Byzantine officials, or the Muslim communities who defended their homes, the First Crusade remains a deeply complex chapter of medieval history, reminding us that great historical events are rarely simple and are almost always experienced very differently by the people who lived through them. For the people who actually lived through these events, history was not a collection of famous dates or dramatic paintings. It was a daily struggle to survive. A young knight might spend months repairing worn armor instead of fighting. A pilgrim could walk for weeks with sore feet, carrying only a small bag containing bread, a wooden cup, and a blanket. Merchants worried about protecting valuable goods from thieves, while farmers living near contested frontiers wondered whether another army would soon pass through their fields. Life continued even while great political changes unfolded around them. Children were born, families celebrated marriages, craftsmen built homes, and monks quietly copied books by candlelight, preserving knowledge that would outlive kings and conquerors alike. The First Crusade also reminds modern historians how difficult it is to understand the past through only one perspective. Christian chroniclers often describe the expedition as a remarkable act of faith and perseverance, emphasizing miracles, courage, and devotion. Muslim historians, meanwhile, wrote about the arrival of foreign armies, the suffering experienced by local communities, and the determination to defend their homeland. Byzantine writers frequently viewed both sides through the lens of imperial politics, focusing on alliances, diplomacy, and the survival of their empire. Each account contains valuable information, but each was shaped by the experiences, beliefs, and priorities of the people who recorded it. By comparing these different voices, historians can build a more balanced picture of what truly happened more than 9 centuries ago. Archaeology has also added remarkable new details. Excavations around ancient castles, campsites, churches, and city walls have uncovered broken arrowheads, pieces of armor, pottery, coins, tools, and everyday household objects. These discoveries remind us that history is not made only by famous leaders whose names appear in books. It is also created by ordinary men and women whose personal stories were never written down, but whose lives left quiet traces beneath the soil. Standing today on the ancient walls of Jerusalem or among the ruins of Crusader fortresses, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, it is possible to imagine the footsteps of countless travelers who once believed they were taking part in an extraordinary mission that would shape the future. Their journey transformed kingdoms, connected distant cultures in unexpected ways, and became one of the most discussed chapters of medieval history. Even after more than 900 years, the First Crusade continues to invite careful study, encouraging us to look beyond simple victories or defeats, and instead understand the hopes, fears, sacrifices, and ambitions of the people who lived through one of history's most remarkable expeditions. Over the centuries, the First Crusade became more than a historical event. It entered songs, poems, paintings, and legends throughout Europe and the Middle East. Medieval storytellers often transformed real people into larger-than-life heroes, describing impossible victories, miraculous escapes, and dramatic speeches that were never recorded by eyewitnesses. While these stories entertained audiences, modern historians carefully compare them with surviving letters, official documents, archaeological discoveries, and contemporary chronicles to separate legend from historical fact. This process reminds us that history is always a puzzle, with each surviving source providing only one piece of the complete picture. Today, researchers continue to uncover new information about the Crusaders, remarkable journey. Ancient fortifications have been carefully excavated, revealing how walls were strengthened, how siege engines may have been positioned, and where fierce fighting most likely occurred. Coins discovered beneath ruined buildings help. Historians date important events with surprising accuracy. Fragments of pottery, cooking utensils, animal bones, and simple tools reveal what ordinary people ate, how they prepared food, and how they lived during times of both peace and war. Even tiny discoveries, such as a worn leather shoe or the iron buckle from a soldier's belt, offer valuable clues about daily life nearly 1,000 years ago. Scientific techniques have also transformed our understanding of the medieval world. Researchers analyze pollen trapped beneath ancient soil, allowing them to reconstruct the landscapes crossed by the crusading armies. The remains of seeds and plants reveal which crops were grown around castles and villages, while studies of human skeletons provide evidence of nutrition, disease, injuries, and the physical demands placed upon medieval travelers. These discoveries show that many crusaders endured extraordinary hardship long before reaching the battlefield. Endless walking, poor diets, exposure to harsh weather, and limited medical knowledge tested their strength every single day. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to imagine the First Crusade only as a series of famous battles. Yet its deeper story is about movement, survival, belief, and human determination. Thousands of people left familiar homes without knowing whether they would ever return. They crossed continents using little more than determination. Faith, local guides, and rough directions passed from traveler to traveler. Some reached Jerusalem, many never did, and countless others disappeared into history without leaving behind a single written word. Yet together they shaped an event whose influence extended across politics, religion, trade, architecture, scholarship, and culture for centuries. Their footsteps faded from the dusty roads long ago, but the questions raised by their remarkable journey continue to inspire historians, archaeologists, and curious readers who seek to understand one of the most fascinating chapters of the medieval world. As historians continue studying the First Crusade, they increasingly focus not only on kings and famous commanders, but also on the ordinary people whose names were never recorded. Among the thousands who traveled east were blacksmiths who repaired damaged swords and horseshoes, carpenters who built bridges and siege towers, cooks who stretched limited supplies into simple meals, and priests who offered comfort during moments of fear and uncertainty. Every successful army depended on far more than skilled warriors. Without craftsmen, laborers, guides, merchants, and families willing to endure unimaginable hardships, the expedition could never have reached Jerusalem. Their quiet contributions rarely appeared in medieval chronicles, yet they formed the foundation upon which the entire campaign depended. Travel itself was an enormous challenge in the 11th century. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks winding through forests, mountains, or open plains. Bridges could be damaged by floods. Rivers sometimes became impossible to cross after heavy rain, and travelers constantly watched the horizon for signs of danger. Maps were rare and often inaccurate, forcing many groups to rely on local guides who understood the surrounding landscape. Communication between different armies was equally difficult because participants spoke many languages, including French, Norman, German, Italian, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, and Turkish. Misunderstandings were common, and simple negotiations could require several interpreters before agreements were reached. Despite these obstacles, thousands of people managed to coordinate one of the longest military expeditions of the medieval world. Their achievement reflected remarkable organization as well as determination. The First Crusade also reminds us that history is rarely a story with only one ending. For some participants, The journey fulfilled a lifelong dream of reaching Jerusalem. Others found new homes in the East and never returned to Europe. Many families waited years for loved ones who would never come back, never learning exactly where they had fallen or been buried. Across Europe and the Middle East, memories of the expedition shaped future generations in very different ways, influencing politics, religion, literature, and identity. Even today, scholars continue examining newly discovered documents and archaeological evidence, asking fresh questions about events that occurred more than 9 centuries ago. Each discovery adds another small piece to the remarkable story of the First Crusade, reminding us that the past is never completely finished. As long as people continue exploring ancient ruins, translating forgotten manuscripts, and comparing voices from different cultures, this extraordinary journey will remain alive in history, inviting every new generation to understand the medieval world with greater balance, curiosity, and respect. The legacy of the First Crusade can still be seen in many places today. Visitors walking through the old city of Jerusalem pass ancient walls, narrow streets, and historic churches that have witnessed countless generations since the events of 1099. Along the Mediterranean coast, the impressive ruins of Crusader castles still stand on rocky hills, their thick stone walls overlooking the sea, just as they did hundreds of years ago. Some fortresses remain so well preserved that visitors can walk through great halls, climb towers, and imagine what life was like. For the soldiers who once guarded these distant frontiers, although the sounds of battle disappeared long ago, the stones themselves continue to tell silent stories about the people who built, defended, and lived within them. Modern archaeology has helped reveal details that medieval writers never recorded. Excavations have uncovered kitchens where meals were prepared, workshops where armor was repaired, wells that supplied precious water during long sieges, and chapels where prayers were offered before dangerous campaigns. Animal bones found beneath castle floors show what people ate, while fragments of imported pottery reveal the wide trading networks that connected Europe with the eastern Mediterranean. Even small objects such as children's toys, glass beads, wooden combs, and simple cooking pots remind us that ordinary families lived alongside soldiers in many Crusader settlements. Daily life continued despite the constant possibility of conflict. Farmers planted crops, merchants bargained in busy markets, children learned trades from their parents, and monks carefully copied manuscripts that preserved valuable knowledge for future generations. Looking at these discoveries, it becomes clear that history is not remembered only through famous battles. It is also preserved through the everyday lives of ordinary people whose names have been forgotten. The First Crusade remains one of history's most carefully studied events because it connected distant civilizations in ways that were both peaceful and violent, encouraging trade, cultural exchange, diplomacy, and conflict at the same time. It transformed kingdoms, influenced religious thought, reshaped political alliances, and inspired generations of writers, artists, and historians more than 900 years later. Researchers continue examining newly translated manuscripts, forgotten letters, and archaeological discoveries, proving that even after centuries have passed, the story is still evolving. Every new discovery allows us to understand the people of the medieval world a little more clearly, reminding us that history is never completely finished. Instead, it is an endless conversation between the past and the present, inviting us to explore old questions with fresh evidence while appreciating the remarkable journey of those who crossed continents in search of faith, purpose, and a future they could scarcely imagine. The First Crusade also left a lasting influence on architecture. As Crusader kingdoms became established, builders combined European ideas with local construction techniques that had been developed over many centuries in the Middle East. Castles grew larger and stronger, with thick defensive walls, rounded towers that could better withstand attack, and carefully designed gateways that slowed invading armies. Engineers learned valuable lessons about fortifications after witnessing powerful sieges in both Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. These ideas later spread back across Europe, where new castles reflected many of the innovations first encountered during the crusading period. Religious buildings also displayed a fascinating mixture of artistic traditions. Stone carvings, arches, and decorative patterns often revealed influences from several cultures, reminding historians that even during times of conflict, knowledge and craftsmanship continued to travel between different societies. The crusading era also changed the way many Europeans understood geography. Before the expedition, distant regions such as Syria, Palestine, and Anatolia existed mostly in stories told by pilgrims or preserved in ancient texts. After thousands of travelers returned home, descriptions of rivers, mountains, ports, and cities became far more detailed. Although medieval maps still contained many inaccuracies, geographical knowledge slowly expanded as merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims continued moving between Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Ports became busier than ever before, connecting communities separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Ships carried not only goods but also ideas, languages, artistic styles, and scientific knowledge that gradually influenced everyday life on both sides of the Mediterranean Sea. Historians often emphasize that the First Crusade cannot be understood as a simple story of heroes and enemies. It involved countless individuals whose experiences were remarkably different. Knight viewed the journey differently from a merchant. A monk experienced it differently from a local farmer, and a child growing up inside a frontier castle saw the world differently from someone living safely in a European village. Every participant carried personal hopes, fears, and beliefs that shaped the decisions they made. This variety of perspectives is one reason why the First Crusade continues to fascinate scholars today. Each newly translated manuscript, archaeological excavation, or historical discovery adds another small piece to an enormous puzzle that is still being assembled. More than 900 years after the First Crusaders began their long march toward Jerusalem, historians continue searching for new evidence, reminding us that the past is never completely silent. Every castle ruin, weathered inscription, forgotten letter, and ancient coin offers another opportunity to better understand the people whose extraordinary journey became one of the defining stories of the medieval world. The First Crusade also influenced the development of medieval law and diplomacy in unexpected ways. As new Crusader states were established, their rulers had to govern people from many different cultural and religious backgrounds. Latin Christians, Eastern Christians, Muslims, and Jewish communities often lived within the same regions, each following their own traditions and customs. Managing such diverse populations required practical solutions rather than constant conflict. Local officials negotiated agreements over trade, taxes, water supplies, farmland, and the safety of travelers. Although tensions certainly remained, daily life often depended upon cooperation between neighboring communities. Merchants continued buying and selling goods regardless of political rivalries, knowing that successful trade benefited everyone involved. This practical cooperation reminds us that history is rarely defined only by warfare. Even during periods remembered for battles, countless ordinary people focused on earning a living, raising families, repairing homes, harvesting crops, and preparing for the changing seasons. Historians also study the First Crusade because it demonstrates how information spread across medieval Europe. Without newspapers, radio, or the internet, important news traveled through sermons, handwritten letters, royal messengers, and conversations between travelers. A single report carried by a returning pilgrim might be repeated hundreds of times before reaching a distant village. Along the way, details could change. New stories might be added, and rumors often mixed with genuine facts. This explains why surviving medieval accounts sometimes describe the same event in very different ways. Modern scholars compare these sources carefully, looking for details that appear consistently across multiple independent records. Archaeological discoveries then provide another way to test those written accounts. When documents and physical evidence support one another, historians gain greater confidence in their conclusions. Today, advanced technology has opened entirely new possibilities for studying the crusading world. Satellites help identify forgotten settlements hidden beneath farmland. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried walls without disturbing archaeological sites, and digital mapping allows researchers to reconstruct the routes, followed by medieval armies with remarkable accuracy. Museums around the world preserve swords, helmets, coins, manuscripts, religious objects, and everyday household items connected to the period, allowing visitors to see tangible reminders of people who lived nearly 1,000 years ago. Each artifact represents an individual life, a personal journey, or a forgotten moment in history. Together, these discoveries remind us that the First Crusade was far more than a sequence of famous battles. It was a complex human story shaped by courage, hardship, faith, ambition, curiosity, and survival, leaving behind a legacy that historians continue exploring with every new generation. As interest in the First Crusade has continued through the centuries, historians have learned an important lesson. The past is rarely as simple as it first appears. Early history books often describe the Crusade from only one point of view, but modern research brings together Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Byzantine sources to build a fuller picture of what happened. Each community experienced the same events in different ways, and every account adds another valuable perspective. Rather than asking who was entirely right or wrong, many historians now focus on understanding why people made the choices they did and how those choices shaped the medieval world. This approach helps us see history not as a single story, but as many stories woven together across time. Universities around the world continue translating forgotten manuscripts that have remained unread for centuries. Some are written in Latin, others in Greek, Arabic, Armenian, Syriac, or Hebrew. Every newly translated document has the potential to reveal details that previous generations never knew. A simple letter between two rulers might explain why an alliance changed. A monastery record may describe the arrival of weary pilgrims. A merchant's account book could reveal which goods traveled across the Mediterranean and how trade survived even during years of conflict. These ordinary documents often provide just as much insight as famous royal chronicles. Archaeologists also continue making remarkable discoveries. Beneath ancient cities, they uncover layers of buildings that reveal how communities changed over hundreds of years. Burned timbers may mark the remains of a siege, while repaired walls show how survivors rebuilt after destruction. Coins buried beneath collapsed houses help establish precise dates, and tiny fragments of glass or pottery reveal where everyday objects were manufactured before being carried across continents. Even pollen preserved underground allows scientists to reconstruct medieval landscapes, showing which trees, crops, and wild plants surrounded Crusader settlements nearly 1,000 years ago. Together, these discoveries remind us that history is never truly finished. Every generation asks new questions, develops better technology, and uncovers fresh evidence that deepens our understanding of the past. The First Crusade remains one of the best-studied events of the Middle Ages, not only because of its military importance, but because it connects faith, politics, trade, architecture, exploration, and ordinary human experience into a single remarkable journey. Although the armies completed their march centuries ago, their story continues to travel across time, inviting modern readers to explore the medieval world with curiosity, patience, and a willingness to understand people whose lives were both very different from our own and, in many ways, surprisingly familiar. The memory of the First Crusade has never completely faded. During the centuries that followed, writers, artists, and historians continued returning to this remarkable journey, each interpreting it through the values of their own time. Medieval chroniclers often described the expedition as a story of courage and devotion, while later Renaissance scholars examined it as an important political event. In the modern era, historians have taken an even broader approach, studying not only battles and rulers, but also climate, economics, travel, medicine, and everyday life. By combining archaeology, written records, and scientific research, they have created a far richer understanding of what happened between 1096 and 1099. This ongoing work reminds us that history is constantly evolving as new discoveries appear. Museums across Europe and the Middle East now preserve thousands of objects connected to the crusading period. Visitors can see chainmail armor, carefully forged swords, decorated helmets, bronze cooking pots, handwritten manuscripts, and beautifully crafted religious artifacts. Many of these items belonged not to famous kings or commanders, but to ordinary people whose names have long been forgotten. Holding such objects in their hands, museum conservators often remember that every scratch on a shield or worn edge on a sword represents a real person who once faced uncertainty, exhaustion, and hope during one of history's longest journeys. Even a simple wooden spoon or leather shoe can tell an important story about daily life in the medieval world. Technology has also transformed the study of the First Crusade. High-resolution satellite imagery helps researchers identify ancient roads hidden beneath modern landscapes, while three-dimensional laser scanning allows damaged castles and churches to be digitally preserved for future generations. Computer models recreate medieval cities as they may have appeared before. Centuries of rebuilding changed their appearance. These tools help historians test old theories and ask entirely new questions about how armies moved, where people lived, and how communities adapted to changing political conditions. Every year, international teams continue excavating ancient sites, carefully documenting each discovery before adding another piece to the historical puzzle. Perhaps the greatest lesson left by the First Crusade is that history is shaped by countless individual lives, rather than only a handful of famous leaders. Behind every army stood families waiting at home, merchants risking dangerous journeys, craftsmen repairing equipment, doctors caring for the wounded, monks preserving knowledge, and children growing up in a rapidly changing world. Their experiences remind us that major historical events are always made up of ordinary human stories. More than 900 years later, the roads once traveled by the Crusaders have grown quiet, yet their remarkable expedition continues to inspire research, discussion, and reflection, encouraging each new generation to explore the medieval past with curiosity, patience, and a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human history. Today, nearly 1,000 years after the First Crusade began, its story continues to encourage thoughtful discussion rather than simple conclusions. Historians emphasize that understanding the Crusade requires patience, careful reading of many different sources, and respect for the people who experienced those extraordinary events from very different perspectives. The medieval world was far more connected than many people once believed. Pilgrims traveled enormous distances. Merchants crossed dangerous seas. Diplomats negotiated between rival kingdoms, and scholars exchanged ideas that shaped future generations. The First Crusade became part of this larger network, influencing not only warfare, but also trade, architecture, literature, and cultural exchange throughout the Mediterranean region. One of the most remarkable aspects of the expedition was the sheer distance covered by its participants. Many crusaders had never traveled farther than the nearest market town before setting out. Yet they crossed mountains covered in snow, wide rivers without permanent bridges, dry plains where water was difficult to find, and unfamiliar cities filled with the languages they had never heard before. Every sunrise brought new uncertainty, and every successful day of travel represented another small victory over the hardships of medieval life. Unlike modern travelers, they possessed no accurate maps, no reliable weather forecasts, and no quick means of communication with home. Once they left their villages behind, many would never again see the families they had said goodbye to years earlier. This reality reminds us just how extraordinary their journey truly was. Modern researchers also recognize that many myths surrounding the First Crusade developed long after the events themselves. Over hundreds of years, storytellers added dramatic speeches, legendary heroes, and miraculous episodes that reflected the beliefs of later generations rather than the evidence preserved by eyewitnesses. Separating legend from documented history remains one of the most fascinating challenges facing historians today. Every newly discovered manuscript, archaeological excavation, or scientific analysis contributes another small piece to the puzzle, allowing us to understand the medieval world with greater clarity than ever before. Although the castles have weathered, the banners have disappeared, and the soldiers themselves have long since become part of history. The questions raised by the First Crusade continue to inspire curiosity around the world. Its legacy survives not only in ancient ruins and museum collections, but also in the ongoing effort to better understand one of the most remarkable journeys ever undertaken during the Middle Ages. Perhaps the greatest reason the First Crusade continues to capture people's imagination is that it reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of humanity. Throughout the expedition, courage often existed beside fear, hope beside despair, generosity beside hardship, and determination beside exhaustion. Some travelers willingly shared their last pieces of bread with strangers, while others struggled simply to survive another day. These small human moments are just as important as the famous battles because they remind us that history is lived one day at a time. Behind every great event are countless ordinary decisions made by ordinary people. Looking across the centuries, it becomes clear that no single story can fully explain the First Crusade. It was a religious pilgrimage for some, a military campaign for others, an opportunity for adventure, or simply a journey toward an unknown future. Each participant carried different expectations, and many discovered that reality was far more difficult than they had imagined when they first left home. Yet, despite the hardships, the expedition permanently changed the medieval world. It reshaped relationships between kingdoms, expanded long-distance trade, encouraged the movement of ideas, and connected societies that had previously known little about one another. Even after the crusading armies disappeared, these new connections continued influencing history for generations. Today, visitors standing among the ancient stones of Jerusalem, Antioch, or the great Crusader castles along the Mediterranean coast often experience a quiet sense of reflection. The walls that once echoed with marching soldiers now stand in silence. Birds fly above towers that were once crowded with watchmen, and peaceful streets now cross places where fierce battles unfolded centuries ago. Time has transformed these locations from battlefields into historical landmarks, visited by people from every corner of the world. Historians, archaeologists, and travelers continue returning to these places not to relive the conflicts, but to better understand the people who lived through them. Their research reminds us that history is never simply about victories or defeats. It is about human lives, difficult choices, unexpected consequences, and the lasting impact that a single journey can have across many generations. More than 900 years after the First Crusade began, its remarkable story continues to encourage curiosity, careful study, and respect for the complexity of the medieval past, ensuring that this extraordinary chapter of history will never be completely forgotten. As we reach the end of this remarkable journey, the First Crusade remains one of the defining stories of the Middle Ages, not because it offers simple answers, but because it reveals how complex history truly is. Thousands of people from different backgrounds, speaking different languages and carrying different hopes, followed the same road toward Jerusalem. Some were experienced knights. Others were humble farmers, craftsmen, merchants, or pilgrims who had never imagined leaving their homes. Each person experienced the expedition differently, yet together they became part of an event that changed the course of history. Their footsteps disappeared long ago, but the consequences of their journey continued shaping politics, religion, trade, and culture for centuries afterward. Modern historians still debate many details of the First Crusade, and that is one reason it remains such a fascinating subject. Every newly translated manuscript, every archaeological excavation, and every scientific discovery adds another piece to the historical puzzle. Instead of viewing the past as a fixed story, researchers understand that history continues to grow as new evidence is uncovered. This ongoing search for knowledge reminds us that the medieval world was far more connected, diverse, and complicated than people once believed. Looking back across more than 900 years, the First Crusade stands not only as a tale of battles and distant kingdoms, but also as a reminder of humanity's endless desire to explore, believe, struggle, and endure. Ancient castles may now stand in silence, and the roads once traveled by the Crusaders may have changed beyond recognition. Yet their extraordinary journey continues to inspire historians and curious readers around the world. And with that, our peaceful journey through the story of the First Crusade comes to an end. Thank you for joining me as we explored one of history's most remarkable expeditions. I hope you enjoyed this relaxing journey into the medieval past. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next history adventure. Although the First Crusade officially ended in 1099, its influence continued to shape the medieval world for generations. Children born in the new Crusader states grew up in a land unlike the one their parents had left behind in Europe. They heard several languages in the streets, traded with merchants from distant countries, and lived among people with different customs and traditions. Many of them had never even seen the homelands. Their families had once crossed continents to leave. Their world was one where East and West met every day through trade, diplomacy, religion, and daily life. This blending of cultures created a unique society that could not be found anywhere else in the medieval world. Travelers arriving from Europe were often surprised to discover that life in the Holy Land was far more complicated than they had imagined. Instead of endless warfare, they found busy marketplaces, thriving ports, peaceful farming villages, and communities where cooperation was often necessary for survival. Even during periods of political tension, merchants continued exchanging goods because trade benefited everyone involved. Silk from the East, fine glass, spices, olive oil, sugar, and beautifully crafted metalwork all found their way into European markets, while timber, cloth, weapons, and other products traveled in the opposite direction. These commercial connections helped strengthen the Mediterranean economy and encouraged people from different backgrounds to interact more frequently than before. The crusading period also influenced architecture in lasting ways. Massive stone castles built during the 12th century demonstrated new ideas about defense, engineering, and construction. Many featured concentric walls, improved gatehouses, deep moats, and powerful towers designed to resist long sieges. Historians believe that lessons learned during the Crusades contributed to the evolution of castle design across Europe, where rulers adopted similar defensive features in their own fortifications. Religious buildings reflected this cultural exchange as well, combining artistic traditions from several regions into distinctive architectural styles. Today, many of these structures remain standing despite centuries of earthquakes, wars, and changing empires. Walking through their ancient halls, it is easy to imagine the footsteps of pilgrims, merchants, monks, soldiers, and local families who once passed beneath the same stone arches. Their voices have faded into history. Yet the buildings they left behind continue telling silent stories to every visitor who pauses to listen. As historians uncover more evidence each year, the First Crusade becomes not simply a tale of conquest, but a remarkable chapter in the broader story of how different civilizations met, influenced one another, and shaped the medieval world in ways that still echo through history today. Even after the Crusader states had become established, life along their borders remained uncertain. Peace could last for months or even years, but everyone understood that conditions could change quickly. Watchtowers overlooked important roads, and guards carefully observed the surrounding countryside for signs of approaching armies or raiding parties. Messengers on horseback carried urgent letters between castles, often traveling day and night to deliver important news. These networks of communication helped rulers coordinate defenses across territories, separated by mountains, rivers, and deserts. At the same time, ordinary people continued living surprisingly normal lives, despite the constant possibility of conflict. Farmers planted wheat, barley, and olives. Shepherds guided flocks across rocky hillsides. Fishermen worked along the Mediterranean coast, and craftsmen filled workshops with the sounds of hammers, saws, and spinning wheels. Markets remained the heart of many towns, where buyers and sellers gathered to exchange goods from across the known world. A traveler might find spices from distant Asia, glass produced in Syria, cloth woven in Europe, and finally crafted jewelry displayed side by side on the same market street. These thriving commercial centers demonstrated that cooperation often continued even when political relationships were strained. Pilgrims also remained an important part of life in the Holy Land. Every year, thousands journeyed from Europe, hoping to pray at places connected with the life of Jesus. Many traveled in organized groups for safety, accompanied by local guides who knew the safest roads and the locations of reliable wells and resting places. Along the routes, monasteries and hospices welcomed exhausted travelers, offering food, water, and simple shelter before they continued their long journeys. Some pilgrims returned home with detailed accounts describing the cities, landscapes, and customs they had witnessed, providing valuable information for future generations of historians. These written descriptions remain among the most important sources for understanding everyday life during the crusading era. As centuries passed, many crusader castles changed hands several times, reflecting the shifting balance of power throughout the region. Some were expanded by new rulers, while others gradually fell into ruin after losing their military importance. Nature slowly reclaimed abandoned walls as grasses grew between the stones, and birds nested inside empty towers. Yet, despite the passage of time, these remarkable fortresses continue, standing as powerful reminders of an age when thousands of people crossed continents, driven by faith, determination, curiosity, and hope. Today they attract historians, archaeologists, architects, and visitors from around the world, all seeking to better understand the remarkable civilization that emerged after the First Crusade and the lasting influence it left on the medieval world. The influence of the First Crusade reached beyond the lands where it was fought. Across Europe, people who had never traveled farther than their nearest town listened with amazement as returning pilgrims described the great cities of the East. They spoke of towering walls, crowded harbors filled with ships from distant kingdoms, colorful markets overflowing with spices, silk, perfumes, and precious metals, and churches unlike any they had seen before. These stories inspired curiosity about the wider world and encouraged more people to travel, trade, and explore. Although medieval journeys remained slow and dangerous, knowledge spread farther than ever before through conversations, handwritten letters, and the memories of those who had completed the long pilgrimage. At the same time, rulers across Europe carefully studied the successes and failures of the First Crusade. They learned how difficult it was to organize thousands of people from different regions under a single cause. Supplying such a large force required careful planning, reliable transportation, and cooperation between nobles who often disagreed with one another. Food, clean water, weapons, horses, and medical care all had to be arranged months in advance. Even the strongest army could fail if its supply lines collapsed. These practical lessons influenced military planning for generations, shaping the way future campaigns were prepared throughout medieval Europe. Beyond warfare, the crusading period encouraged greater interest in geography and navigation. Sailors improved their understanding of Mediterranean sea routes, while map makers slowly gathered more accurate information about distant coastlines, rivers, and mountain ranges. Though medieval maps were still far from perfect, each generation added new details collected from merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, and explorers. Over time, this growing knowledge helped connect Europe with regions that had once seemed unimaginably distant. Historians often point out that the First Crusade marked a turning point because it increased contact between societies that had previously interacted less frequently. While conflict certainly played a major role, so did trade, diplomacy, architecture, scholarship, and cultural exchange. Languages borrowed new words, artistic styles blended together, and practical knowledge traveled alongside merchants and pilgrims. Looking back after more than 9 centuries, the First Crusade remains an extraordinary reminder that history is rarely defined by a single event alone. Instead, its greatest impact often appears in the generations that follow, as ordinary people adapt to changing circumstances and quietly shape the future in ways they could never have imagined. That is why historians continue returning to this remarkable chapter of the medieval world, discovering new evidence that helps us better understand not only the Crusaders themselves, but the wider civilization they helped transform. Over the following centuries, the memory of the First Crusade continued to shape how medieval people understood both their past and their future. Monasteries preserved handwritten chronicles describing the long journey from Western Europe to Jerusalem, carefully copying each page by candlelight so that future generations would not forget what had happened. Every copy introduced small differences, whether through simple mistakes or the addition of new details, which is why historians today often compare many versions of the same text before reaching conclusions. These surviving manuscripts have become some of the most valuable windows into the medieval world, allowing modern researchers to hear voices that have remained silent for nearly 1,000 years. Yet written records tell only part of the story. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing the everyday lives of people who never appeared in famous chronicles. Excavations at Crusader settlements have uncovered bread ovens where families prepared meals, workshops where blacksmiths repaired damaged armor, storage rooms filled with grain jars, and small chapels where travelers gathered to pray before continuing their journeys. These discoveries remind us that behind every famous battle stood thousands of ordinary people whose daily routines kept entire communities alive. Without builders, farmers, merchants, sailors, and craftsmen, no kingdom could survive for long. Climate researchers have also contributed to our understanding of the period by studying tree rings, lake sediments, and ancient pollen. Their work helps reconstruct weather conditions that influenced harvests, food supplies, and military campaigns. A single year of poor rainfall could create shortages that affected entire regions, making long expeditions even more difficult than medieval. Writers sometimes described. Historians now combine these scientific findings with written sources to build a more complete picture of the challenges faced by crusaders and local populations alike. This combination of history and science has transformed the study of the Middle Ages, showing that great historical events were influenced not only by kings and generals, but also by nature itself. Today, the First Crusade remains one of the best documented and most carefully examined events of medieval history. Scholars from many countries continue working together, sharing discoveries and comparing evidence from different languages and traditions. Their goal is not simply to celebrate victories or remember defeats, but to understand how one remarkable journey changed the lives of countless individuals across Europe and the Middle East. More than 9 centuries later, the story continues to evolve with every new excavation, every newly translated manuscript, and every question asked by another generation eager to better understand the extraordinary world of the Middle Ages. Another reason the First Crusade remains so important is that it transformed the study of medieval history itself. For many years, scholars focused almost entirely on famous leaders such as Pope Urban II, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse. Today, however, historians ask much broader questions. What did ordinary pilgrims eat during the journey? How were horses cared for during months of travel? What diseases spread through the camps? And how did medieval doctors attempt to treat them? How did women and children experience life during the expedition? These questions help create a richer and more human picture of the crusade. Instead of seeing history only through the decisions of powerful rulers, researchers now examine the lives of everyone who took part in the remarkable journey. Museums have become important partners in this effort. Conservators carefully preserve fragile manuscripts, rusted weapons, fragments of clothing, and delicate religious objects that survived beneath the earth for centuries. Each artifact must be cleaned, documented, photographed, and protected from damage so future generations can continue studying it. Sometimes a single coin discovered during an excavation changes historians' understanding of when a castle was occupied. At other times, a forgotten letter found in a monastery. Archive reveals unexpected details about diplomacy or everyday life. These small discoveries may seem ordinary, but together they build an increasingly detailed picture of the medieval world. Advances in digital technology have also opened exciting possibilities. Ancient manuscripts can now be scanned in extremely high resolution, allowing faded writing to become readable once again. Three-dimensional computer models recreate castles exactly as they may have appeared hundreds of years ago, while virtual reconstructions help visitors imagine crowded marketplaces, busy ports, and towering city walls that no longer survive in their original form. Students from around the world can now explore these historical sites without leaving their classrooms, making medieval history more accessible than ever before. The First Crusade, therefore, continues to educate not only professional historians, but also millions of curious people interested in understanding the past. It reminds us that history is not frozen in time. Every generation discovers new evidence, develops better research methods, and asks different questions. Because of this, our understanding of the First Crusade continues to grow with each passing year. Although the people who lived through these events could never have imagined modern archaeology, satellite mapping, or digital archives, their experiences continue to guide researchers searching for a deeper understanding of one of the most remarkable journeys in medieval history, ensuring that its legacy will continue inspiring curiosity for generations yet to come. One of the most fascinating aspects of the First Crusade is how its story continues to connect people across many different fields of study. Historians examine medieval chronicles to understand political decisions. Archaeologists uncover the remains of forgotten settlements. Architects analyze the design of Crusader castles, while linguists study the many languages spoken by the people who lived in the region. Together, these different areas of research reveal that the crusading world was far more diverse than earlier. Generations once believed travelers from France, Normandy, Italy, Germany, Armenia, Greece, and the Middle East often met in the same towns and ports, exchanging ideas as well as goods. Although their beliefs, customs, and traditions sometimes differed greatly, daily life often required cooperation. Wells had to be maintained, roads repaired, crops harvested, ships unloaded, and markets supplied regardless of political tensions. This practical reality reminds us that ordinary life continued even during periods remembered for conflict. Families celebrated weddings, children learned trades from their parents, musicians entertained crowded marketplaces, and monks quietly copied books inside peaceful monasteries. Medieval society never stood still. It continued growing and adapting despite the uncertainties of the age. The First Crusade also changed how future generations viewed long-distance travel. Before the expedition, many Europeans knew the Holy Land only through religious teachings or stories told by a handful of pilgrims. After thousands returned home, knowledge of distant landscapes became much more detailed. Descriptions of mountains, rivers, deserts, ports, and ancient cities circulated across Europe, encouraging greater curiosity about the wider world. These accounts inspired later travelers who continued exploring the Eastern Mediterranean for trade, diplomacy, scholarship, and pilgrimage. Some medieval maps even became more accurate as new information gradually reached European mapmakers. Today, researchers continue comparing written descriptions with archaeological evidence, discovering that many ancient routes described nearly 1,000 years ago can still be traced across the modern landscape. Standing beside those old roads, it is possible to imagine endless lines of travelers, slowly moving toward an uncertain future, carrying little more than hope, determination, and faith. Their remarkable journey reminds us that history is shaped not only by dramatic victories or famous leaders, but also by countless ordinary people whose courage, endurance, and daily choices quietly changed the course of the medieval world. That enduring human story is why the First Crusade continues to captivate readers, historians, and travelers. Nearly a millennium after the first footsteps began the long road toward Jerusalem. As the centuries passed, the First Crusade became more than a medieval campaign. It became a subject that helped historians understand how civilizations interact over long periods of time. Rather than viewing the expedition as an isolated event, modern scholars place it within a much larger history of the Mediterranean, where merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, sailors, and scholars had crossed the sea for hundreds of years before the Crusaders arrived. The Mediterranean was not simply a barrier separating continents. It was a bridge connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ports along its shores welcomed ships carrying grain, timber, spices, textiles, ceramics, and precious metals. Alongside these goods traveled languages, customs, religious ideas, artistic styles, and scientific knowledge. The First Crusade unfolded within this already connected world, and although it brought years of conflict, it also became part of a much broader story of cultural exchange. Medieval travelers often returned home with unfamiliar objects that amazed their neighbors. Fine glass from Syrian workshops, carefully woven fabrics, colorful ceramics, fragrant spices, and beautifully decorated metalwork introduced Europeans to craftsmanship unlike anything they had previously seen. At the same time, craftsmen in the Eastern Mediterranean encountered techniques and materials brought from Western Europe. These exchanges influenced architecture, art, and manufacturing for generations. Historians studying surviving buildings often notice details that combine several traditions into a single design, showing that ideas continued to move across cultural boundaries. Despite political tensions, education also benefited from these growing connections. Over time, translations of important works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy reached European scholars, helping preserve and expand knowledge inherited from the ancient world. Medieval universities gradually incorporated many of these texts into their teaching, contributing to intellectual developments that shaped later centuries. Looking back today, it becomes clear that the legacy of the First Crusade cannot be measured only by the cities captured or the battles fought. Its greatest impact may lie in the relationships, exchanges, and questions it created across different societies. Every new archaeological discovery, every restored manuscript, and every carefully translated document reminds us that history is never completely finished. It continues growing as each generation searches for new evidence and asks new questions about the people who walked those ancient roads nearly 1,000 years ago. Their journey remains one of the most remarkable chapters of medieval history, not only because of where it ended, but because of how deeply it influenced the world that followed. Although the First Crusade ended many centuries ago, its legacy continues to influence the modern study of history. Universities around the world dedicate entire courses to understanding not only the military campaign itself, but also the societies that existed before, during, and after the expedition. Students examine medieval letters, royal charters, monastery records, travel journals, and archaeological reports to build a clearer picture of life in the 11th century. They quickly discover that history is rarely black and white. Every source reflects the experiences, beliefs, and priorities of the person who created it. This is why historians compare dozens, sometimes hundreds, of different accounts before drawing conclusions. A single event described by a Latin chronicler, an Arab historian, and a Byzantine official may appear completely different, depending on who witnessed it. Rather than choosing one version alone, modern researchers combine these perspectives to create the most balanced understanding possible. Advances in science have added another remarkable dimension to this work. Laboratory analysis of ancient metals reveals where swords and armor were forged. Studies of animal bones show how armies fed themselves during long campaigns, while chemical analysis of pottery identifies the regions where cooking vessels were produced before traveling hundreds of kilometers through trade. Even fragments of charcoal recovered from old campfires can reveal which types of wood were burned by travelers nearly 1,000 years ago. Every discovery, no matter how small, contributes another piece to the larger historical puzzle. At the same time, preservation has become an international effort. Archaeologists, architects, engineers, and conservators work together to protect surviving castles, churches, manuscripts, and artifacts from the effects of weather, earthquakes, pollution, and modern development. Without this careful work, many of the physical reminders of the First Crusade might disappear forever. Visitors walking through these historic sites today often experience a sense of connection with the past, imagining the countless footsteps that once echoed through the same halls and streets, although the people who lived during the First Crusade could never have imagined satellites, digital archives, or advanced archaeological technology. Their world continues to be explored with tools more powerful than ever before. Every year brings new discoveries, fresh interpretations, and deeper appreciation for one of the most extraordinary journeys in medieval history. The First Crusade therefore remains not only a story about the past, but also a reminder that the search for historical understanding never truly ends, because every generation continues adding new knowledge to the remarkable story of humanity's shared history. The First Crusade also serves as an important reminder that history is preserved not only in famous monuments, but also in fragile pieces of evidence that survive almost by chance. A letter hidden inside a monastery library, a broken clay lamp buried beneath the floor of an ancient house, or a weathered inscription carved into the wall of a forgotten chapel can all transform our understanding of the medieval world. Historians often spend years studying a single collection of documents, carefully translating every sentence and comparing it with other surviving sources. Sometimes a tiny detail, a date, a place name, or the description of a familiar landmark allows researchers to solve mysteries that have remained unanswered for centuries. This careful process requires patience, because every new discovery must be tested against existing evidence before it becomes part of the historical record. That is one reason why our understanding of the First Crusade continues to improve with each generation. The questions historians ask today are often very different from those asked 100 years ago. Instead of focusing only on battles, they investigate climate, agriculture, economics, medicine, transportation, and the daily experiences of ordinary people. They want to know what children learned, what families cooked, how craftsmen built houses, how merchants organized trade, and how communities recovered after periods of conflict. These subjects reveal that medieval society was far more vibrant and interconnected than many people imagine. Across the eastern Mediterranean, farmers cultivated fertile valleys, fishermen worked along the coast, and traders sailed between ports carrying products that linked three continents together. Even in uncertain times, life continued through hard work, cooperation, and adaptation. The First Crusade became only one chapter within this much larger story of medieval civilization. Looking across the centuries, perhaps the greatest lesson left by the First Crusade is the importance of understanding history through many voices, rather than only one. Every culture involved preserved its own memories, and together those memories create a richer picture than any single account could provide. Archaeology, science, literature, architecture, and written chronicles all contribute pieces of the same puzzle. When combined, they allow us to see not only armies and kings, but also the countless ordinary people whose hopes, fears, labor, and resilience shaped the world around them. Their names may have been forgotten, yet the traces they left behind continue guiding historians toward a deeper understanding of one of the most remarkable journeys ever undertaken during the Middle Ages, ensuring that the story of the First Crusade remains alive for future generations to explore and appreciate. Over the past century, the study of the First Crusade has expanded beyond history into many other fields of research. Anthropologists examine how medieval communities adapted to life in frontier settlements. Economists study the movement of goods and currencies across the Mediterranean, while environmental historians investigate how droughts, harvests, and changing weather patterns affected the success of long military campaigns. By combining these different perspectives, researchers have developed a far more complete understanding of the world in which the Crusaders lived. It becomes clear that no expedition, no matter how determined its participants, could succeed through military strength alone. Every journey depended on food supplies, healthy animals, reliable transportation, local knowledge, and the ability to cooperate with people from unfamiliar cultures. These practical realities shaped history just as much as famous battles did. One particularly fascinating area of research involves medieval communication. Without printing presses or modern technology, Information spread slowly through handwritten letters. Official messengers, merchants, and pilgrims, news about victories, defeats, treaties, or political changes could take weeks or even months to travel across Europe. During that time, rumors often changed the original story, adding dramatic details or leaving out important facts. This explains why medieval chronicles sometimes disagree even when describing the same event. Rather than seeing these differences as mistakes, historians treat them as valuable, evidence showing how people understood the world around them. Every writer recorded events through the lens of personal experience, religious belief, and local tradition. Together, these different voices help modern scholars reconstruct a more balanced picture of the past. Preservation remains another important part of the First Crusade's legacy. Ancient castles overlooking the Mediterranean continue to be restored stone by stone, ensuring that future generations can walk through the same halls once used by soldiers, pilgrims, and merchants nearly 1,000 years ago. Libraries carefully protect fragile manuscripts inside climate-controlled rooms, while museums display everyday objects that reveal how ordinary people lived during the crusading period. These efforts remind us that history belongs to everyone, not only to specialists. Every visitor who studies an old map, reads a translated chronicle, or explores the ruins of a medieval fortress becomes part of the continuing effort to understand the past. The First Crusade, therefore, remains far more than a distant memory preserved in history books. It continues inspiring research, discussion, and discovery, proving that even after 9 centuries, humanity's curiosity about the medieval world remains as strong as ever, encouraging each generation to search a little deeper and learn a little more about one of history's most extraordinary journeys. The First Crusade also teaches us something timeless about the importance of preserving history itself. If medieval monks had not carefully copied manuscripts by hand, if travelers had not written letters describing what they witnessed, and if generations of people had not protected ancient churches, castles, and libraries, much of this remarkable story would have disappeared forever. Every surviving document is the result of countless individuals who believed that the past deserved to be remembered. Some manuscripts traveled across kingdoms before finally reaching monasteries where they were stored for centuries. Others survived wars, fires, earthquakes, and changing empires through nothing more than extraordinary luck. Historians often say that every ancient document is a survivor, carrying a voice from another age into the modern world. That is why preserving historical evidence remains one of the most important responsibilities of museums, libraries, and archaeological teams today. Every carefully restored castle wall, every protected excavation site, and every digitized manuscript helps ensure that future generations will continue learning about the medieval world. The First Crusade has also inspired countless books, documentaries, historical novels, museum exhibitions, and academic conferences. Researchers from different countries regularly meet to compare discoveries, discuss newly translated sources, and debate difficult questions that still have no simple answers. Healthy disagreement is an important part of historical research because every conclusion must be supported by reliable evidence rather than tradition or legend. As new technologies continue developing, historians are able to study the past in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. High-resolution photography reveals faded writing hidden beneath damaged parchment, while computer software allows researchers to reconstruct missing sections of manuscripts by comparing hundreds of surviving copies. Artificial intelligence is beginning to assist scholars by identifying patterns across enormous collections of medieval texts, helping researchers locate connections that might otherwise remain unnoticed. Even so, technology cannot replace careful human judgment. Every discovery still requires thoughtful interpretation, patience, and respect for the people whose lives created the historical record. Looking back across nearly 1,000 years, the First Crusade remains one of the most extraordinary journeys ever undertaken during the Middle Ages. Its legacy reaches far beyond battles and castles, reminding us that history is built from millions of individual lives, each contributing a small part to a much larger story. Every traveler who walked toward Jerusalem, every family who waited at home, every craftsman who repaired a sword, every monk who copied a manuscript, and every merchant who crossed the Mediterranean helped shape a chapter of history that continues to educate, challenge, and inspire people around the world today. As historians continue exploring the legacy of the First Crusade, they often remind us that the greatest value of studying history is not simply memorizing names or dates. Instead, it is learning how people responded to extraordinary challenges. The men and women who lived during the 11th century faced uncertainty almost every day. Crops could fail without warning, diseases spread quickly, and long journeys carried enormous risks. Yet communities continued building homes, raising children, practicing their crafts, and preserving their traditions despite these difficulties. Their resilience became one of the defining characteristics of medieval society. The First Crusade reflects that resilience on a remarkable scale. Thousands of individuals traveled farther than they had ever imagined possible, adapting to unfamiliar climates, languages, and cultures while relying on determination and cooperation to survive. Modern historians increasingly recognize that these everyday experiences are just as important as the famous battles described in medieval chronicles. A blacksmith repairing damaged armor, a baker preparing bread for hungry travelers, or a sailor guiding ships safely across the Mediterranean all contributed to the success of long-distance expeditions in ways that were rarely celebrated by contemporary writers. Their quiet work formed the foundation upon which larger historical events depended. This broader perspective has transformed how the medieval world is understood today. Rather than focusing only on rulers and armies, researchers now examine villages, workshops, farms, ports, and marketplaces to better understand how ordinary people shaped history through their daily lives. Excavations continue uncovering household objects that provide remarkable insights into these forgotten communities. A simple cooking pot reveals eating habits. Worn leather shoes show the distances people walked, and children's toys remind us that family life continued even during periods of political uncertainty. These discoveries help bridge the gap between the distant past and the present, allowing us to recognize familiar human experiences across nearly 1,000 years of history. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the First Crusade is not found solely in ancient castles or surviving manuscripts, but in the questions it continues to inspire. Every generation returns to this remarkable story with fresh curiosity, new evidence, and a deeper desire to understand. The people who lived through one of the most extraordinary journeys of the Middle Ages, their world has disappeared. Yet through careful study, archaeology, and historical research, their voices continue reaching across the centuries, reminding us that the past is never truly lost as long as we continue seeking to understand it. As we reflect on the First Crusade from the perspective of the 21st century, it becomes clear that its true importance lies not only in the events themselves, but also in the lessons they leave behind. History reminds us that human societies are deeply connected, even when separated by great distances, different languages, or contrasting beliefs. The people who lived during the crusading era often encountered cultures they had never imagined before beginning their journeys. Some relationships were marked by conflict, while others were shaped by trade, diplomacy, learning, and everyday cooperation. These many forms of interaction gradually transformed the medieval world in ways that continued long after. The armies had disappeared. The roads once traveled by pilgrims and merchants remained active, carrying ideas as well as goods across continents. Ports that welcomed crusaders later became centers of commerce, scholarship, and cultural exchange. Even after political borders changed, the connections established during this period continued influencing generations that followed. Historians studying the First Crusade therefore see it as part of a much larger story about movement, communication, and the exchange of knowledge across the medieval Mediterranean. Every generation discovers new reasons to revisit this remarkable chapter because it offers insight into how societies respond to change, uncertainty, and opportunity. Perhaps that is why the First Crusade has remained a subject of fascination for nearly 1,000 years. It is not simply the story of one expedition, but the story of countless individuals whose lives intersected during an extraordinary moment in history. Some were remembered by name, while millions of others quietly disappeared from the written record. Yet together they shaped events whose influence reached far beyond their own lifetimes. Their castles eventually became ruins, their banners faded, and their footsteps vanished from the dusty roads leading toward Jerusalem. Even so, the traces they left behind continue speaking through ancient manuscripts, weathered stone walls, forgotten artifacts, and the careful work of historians determined to preserve their memory. Every excavation, every translated document, and every restored monument adds another chapter to our understanding of the medieval world. In this way, the First Crusade never truly ends. Instead, it continues living through the questions we ask, the discoveries we make, and the curiosity that encourages each new generation to explore one of history's most remarkable journeys with patience, balance, and an enduring respect for the people whose lives became part of this unforgettable chapter of human history. Although our journey through the First Crusade has covered many battles, kingdoms, and historical discoveries, perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is how it continues to inspire careful research nearly 1,000 years later. Every generation of historians returns to the same questions with new methods and fresh evidence. They compare medieval chronicles written in monasteries with letters preserved in royal archives, examine coins uncovered during archaeological excavations, and study the ruins of castles that still overlook the Mediterranean landscape. Piece by piece, they reconstruct a world that disappeared centuries ago yet still leaves visible traces across Europe and the Middle East. This constant search for understanding reminds us that history is never completely finished. It grows richer each time a forgotten manuscript is translated or an ancient settlement is uncovered beneath the soil. The First Crusade also demonstrates how quickly human lives can be changed by decisions made far away. A farmer working in a quiet French village, a merchant trading in an Italian port, or a craftsman living in Constantinople could all find their futures altered by events unfolding hundreds of kilometers from home. Families adapted to changing circumstances. Communities welcomed travelers from distant lands, and entire regions experienced new economic and cultural connections that continued long after the fighting ended. Even the landscape itself preserves memories of that age. Ancient roads once traveled by pilgrims can still be followed in some places, while weathered fortress walls continue standing against the passage of time. Looking at these places today, it is easy to imagine the countless footsteps that once echoed across the same stones. Some travelers carried swords, others carried trade goods, religious relics, or handwritten letters, yet all became part of a much larger story than they could have imagined. That may be the greatest lesson left by the First Crusade. History is shaped not only by famous rulers and dramatic battles, but also by ordinary people whose daily choices quietly influence the generations that follow. Their courage, fears, ambitions, and determination became woven together into one of the defining chapters of the medieval world. More than 9 centuries later, scholars continue exploring that chapter with respect and curiosity, ensuring that the voices of those who lived through these extraordinary events will never be completely forgotten. As long as people continue asking questions about the past, preserving ancient monuments, and searching for new evidence, the story of the First Crusade will remain alive, reminding us that every journey leaves behind a legacy far greater than the travelers themselves could ever have imagined. Even today, when archaeologists uncover a forgotten fortress or historians translate a faded medieval manuscript, they are continuing the same search for understanding that began centuries ago. Every discovery helps answer old questions while creating new ones. Why did certain settlements survive while others disappeared? How did ordinary families adapt to constant political change? What relationships developed between communities that had once viewed one another as strangers? These questions remind us that history is not a collection of fixed facts, but an ongoing conversation between the past and the present. The First Crusade remains at the center of that conversation because it touched so many parts of medieval life. It influenced religion, diplomacy, commerce, architecture, literature, and even the way people imagined the wider world beyond their own villages. As trade expanded after the crusading period, merchants carried not only valuable goods, but also stories, ideas, artistic techniques, and practical knowledge from one region to another. Cities that had once seemed unimaginably distant became connected through regular sea routes and overland caravans. Ports along the Mediterranean grew busier, welcoming travelers from many different cultures who exchanged languages, customs, and traditions alongside their merchandise. This gradual movement of people and ideas shaped the medieval world in lasting ways that extended far beyond the original expedition to Jerusalem. Historians often describe this process as one of the greatest legacies of the crusading era. While wars eventually ended, the connections created through travel, trade, and communication continued for generations. Looking back after nearly 1,000 years, the First Crusade appears, not simply as a military campaign, but as a turning point in the broader history of Europe and the Middle East. It encouraged exploration, expanded geographical knowledge, strengthened commercial networks, and introduced people to societies they had previously known only through distant stories. The castles, churches, roads, and manuscripts that survive today serve as quiet witnesses to that remarkable age. They remind us that behind every famous event were countless ordinary individuals who cooked meals, repaired tools, cared for animals, copied books, raised children, and kept communities alive despite uncertainty. Their names may never appear in history books, yet without their efforts, the larger story could never have unfolded. That is why the First Crusade continues to fascinate historians across the world. It reveals that history is created not only by extraordinary leaders, but also by millions of ordinary lives woven together across time. Every new discovery, every restored monument, and every carefully translated document brings us one step closer to understanding those lives, ensuring that the remarkable journey of the First Crusade will continue to educate and inspire future generations for many years to come. As our exploration of the First Crusade continues, one idea becomes increasingly clear. History is never truly separated from the people who choose to remember it. Across Europe and the Middle East, generations preserved ancient churches, mosques, fortresses, libraries, and monuments that still stand today as reminders of a remarkable age. Many of these structures have survived earthquakes, wars, changing empires, and centuries of weather because countless individuals believed they were worth protecting. Without those efforts, much of what we know about the medieval world would have disappeared forever. Historians often say that every stone in an old fortress and every page in a fragile manuscript carries a conversation between the past and the present. By studying them carefully, we are able to understand not only what happened, but also how people thought, believed, and lived nearly 1,000 years ago. The First Crusade is especially valuable because it was recorded by many different observers. Latin chroniclers described the hopes of the Crusaders. Byzantine writers focused on imperial politics, while Muslim historians documented the experiences of the communities defending their cities. These different voices sometimes agree and sometimes disagree. Yet together they create a richer and more complete picture than any single account could ever provide. Modern historical research depends upon comparing all of these perspectives rather than relying on only one tradition. This careful approach allows scholars to move beyond legend and come closer to understanding the complex reality of the medieval world. Technology continues to improve this process every year. Ancient manuscripts can now be photographed using special lighting that reveals faded words invisible to the human eye. Digital archives make rare documents available to researchers across the world, while advanced mapping technology helps archaeologists identify forgotten roads, settlements, and defensive walls hidden beneath modern landscapes. Every discovery, no matter how small, becomes another piece of an enormous historical puzzle that is still being assembled. Perhaps this is why the First Crusade remains such a fascinating subject after more than 9 centuries. It reminds us that history is never complete. Every generation asks new questions, uncovers new evidence, and gains a deeper appreciation for the lives of those who came before. Although the armies have long vanished and the banners have faded into memory, the remarkable journey they undertook continues to inspire curiosity, careful research, and thoughtful reflection. In that sense, the First Crusade is not simply a story preserved in old books. It is a living chapter of human history that continues to grow each time someone chooses to explore the medieval past with patience, open-mindedness, and a genuine desire to understand the world that existed so many centuries ago. As historians look toward the future, they recognize that the story of the First Crusade will never be completely finished. New archaeological excavations continue every year, revealing forgotten churches, defensive walls, workshops, and settlements that remained hidden beneath the earth for centuries. Sometimes researchers discover only a few broken pieces of pottery or the foundation of a small building. Yet even these modest finds can answer important historical questions. A single coin may confirm when a fortress was occupied. A fragment of imported ceramic can reveal trade connections stretching across the Mediterranean. The remains of a simple bakery may show how hundreds of travelers were fed during a difficult campaign. In history, the smallest discoveries often have the greatest significance because they help reconstruct the everyday lives of people who left few written records behind. This focus on ordinary life has become one of the most exciting developments in modern medieval research. Rather than studying only kings, popes, and military commanders, historians now ask how families lived, what children learned, how merchants organized their businesses, and how communities rebuilt after conflict. These questions reveal a world filled not only with hardship, but also with resilience, creativity, and cooperation. Even during uncertain times, people continued planting crops, repairing homes, celebrating religious festivals, teaching apprentices, and preserving traditions that connected one generation to the next. These quiet moments of daily life were just as important as the famous battles recorded in medieval chronicles. They formed the foundation upon which entire societies survived. Looking back after nearly 1,000 years, the First Crusade stands as one of history's greatest reminders that human civilization is shaped by countless individual stories woven together across time. Every traveler who crossed mountains toward the Holy Land, every sailor who guided ships across the Mediterranean, every monk who copied fragile manuscripts by candlelight, and every craftsman who built bridges, wagons, or fortress walls contributed something to a larger story they could never fully see. Today, historians continue gathering those scattered pieces, patiently assembling them into a clearer picture of the medieval world. Their work ensures that the voices of the past continue reaching future generations, encouraging curiosity, careful thinking, and respect for the complexity of history. In the end, the First Crusade is remembered not simply because it changed political borders, but because it reveals the extraordinary determination, endurance, and humanity of the people who lived through one of the most remarkable journeys ever recorded during the Middle Ages. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable part of the First Crusade is not simply that thousands of people reached Jerusalem, but that their journey continued shaping history long after the final battle had ended. Kingdoms rose and fell, rulers came and went, and the medieval world slowly transformed into something new. Yet the roads traveled by pilgrims, the castles built upon rocky hills, the monasteries that preserved ancient manuscripts, and the cities that welcomed merchants from distant lands all carried forward the legacy of those extraordinary years. The First Crusade became a turning point whose influence reached far beyond the 11th century, affecting diplomacy, trade, architecture, scholarship, and the relationships between cultures for generations to come. Modern historians continue returning to this story because it reminds us that history is never made by famous leaders alone. Every farmer who harvested grain, every sailor who crossed the Mediterranean, every blacksmith who repaired armor, every monk who copied a manuscript, every merchant who guided a caravan, and every family who waited for loved ones to return played a small but meaningful role in this remarkable chapter of human history. Their names may have faded with time, yet their efforts became part of a much larger story that still echoes across the centuries. Today, visitors standing among the ancient walls of Jerusalem, walking through the ruins of Antioch, or climbing the towers of Crusader castles overlooking the Mediterranean can still feel a quiet connection to the people who once stood in those same places. The sounds of marching armies have disappeared, replaced by the gentle wind moving through old stone corridors where history now rests in silence. Archaeologists continue brushing dust from forgotten artifacts. Historians continue translating fragile manuscripts, and researchers continue asking new questions that bring us closer to understanding the medieval world. Every discovery reminds us that the past is not frozen in time. It lives on through the evidence left behind and through the curiosity of those who seek to understand it. The First Crusade, therefore, remains far more than a story about conflict. It is a story about endurance, belief, exploration, sacrifice, and the extraordinary determination of ordinary people who crossed continents without knowing what awaited them beyond the horizon. Nearly 1,000 years have passed since that long journey began, yet its legacy continues to inspire historians, travelers, and curious minds across the world. And now, as our own journey through this fascinating chapter of history gently comes to an end, we leave the medieval world behind with a deeper appreciation for its complexity, its people, and the enduring lessons it still offers today. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening exploring the story of the First Crusade, and until our next journey into the past, may your night be calm, your dreams be peaceful, and your curiosity for history never fade.